going back to adults and learners, one of the things that I think that I had, one of the pitfalls I had was when to give a gentle nudge and when not to.
Yeah.
Because with my swimmers, I mean, they've heard me raise my voice on many occasions, not in a derogatory manner, but it's when we've been holding up a standard all year, and then things are it's not every day, but some days, we all have them. We all have our weeks, and it seems like there's a full moon out. Everybody kind of happens to be just having an off day on the same day.
Yeah.
But what do you feel about, is there a line of pushing adult learners ever, or what's your opinion on stagnation? I know there's a point where it's like, I'm okay where I'm at, I don't need to go any further.
Yeah.
But do you ever feel like, if you see from a personality standpoint, like that your learner wants to get better,
Yep.
But has just been plateaued for, let's say, 2, 3, 4 weeks?
Yep.
Do you feel like there's a line where it's like, well, let's keep trying to get to that next stage, or?
So my focus on it is that I just don't push. For mine, I don't push.
Sure.
It is. I encourage. I'll talk a lot from the first day. Most of the time, as I'm teaching some skill, I'm thinking about how this is going to help them when they're down in 12 foot, and I start talking with them about. So it doesn't matter today. We're not going today. But when you're down in 12 feet of water, this skill is going to translate this way, right? So I'm always looking ahead to say, this is the way this works. If you want to go this far, this is the way this works for that. And I stay back there, but there are some people, and particularly, and you see them in the master's piece, right? But there are some people who kind of want to be nudged. I mean, it's the way they like to.
Right.
It's the way they like to interact. They like to be challenged. They might not do that themselves, but they like it.
Sure.
And you can usually ask them, and they'll say, "Yeah, I usually want to do that. Otherwise, I'll stay here and be comfortable the whole time." And,
Sure.
And for me, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to let you stay here and be comfortable the whole time, but you can go over with Tim or Bree or whoever, right? And they'll push you along. They'll challenge you a little more directly, and the more advanced somebody is and the further they go down the line, I think the more comfortable they become with that. Well, that's not true. Some people are much more comfortable with that. Other people just want to go at their pace, really, really slow. And any push at all, any nudge at all scares them and moves them out of their point. So I think there's a person line, but I think it's individual, and you just kind of have to ask to see, right?
Sure. Yeah, and with some of the masters, I actually did find that when I first took over with masters, it was during long course as well, mind you, so just a lot more swimming involved. For those of you that aren't, long-time swimmers, long course is full Olympic length, 50 meters, so a lot fewer walls, a lot fewer stoppage. Yeah. You just have to keep moving and keep plodding through the water. I'm personally not very privy to long course. I was a kicker once again, so it's a lot of kicking. If you want to accept Perry's point here, long course kicking, not as fun.
Yeah.
But I found it interesting. We did a lot of free and back, and they said, we want to do IM, and I didn't know that because it's a bunch of adults, adults aren't as plastic. They're not as willing to listen sometimes and not as willing to make changes because they just aren't as malleable. They have pre-existing schemas and notions of fear and things like that. But when they said, we want to do IM, want to do fly, want to do breast, want to do dolphin kick and things like that, I was just taking it easy on them. Pardon me, the 22-year-old at the time that was worried about hips and backs and
those
shoulders.
Old guys,
right? And so I think it's also, and we can get into this later, but talking about coaching kids versus coaching adults and just how starkly different, but surprisingly similar it can be in some ways. But rewinding, it was interesting that they do want to be nudged. I've had a swimmer that asked me to push him harder, give him harder intervals, and and I felt like I was coaching to his strengths. But if he truly wants to push with masters or potentially compete again or what have you, then I think it's really interesting to toe that line.
So I think there's a big difference between again, it's kind of that competitive versus the leisure and versus the comfort piece.
Sure.
Because when you've got folks who want to do the competitive, they're almost always people who've been competitive all their life. Most of them are used to having coaches push them. There are some exceptions, but they're used to having coaches push them. They like that. That's what they expect. If you're not doing that, it's like you're not doing your job. And especially in the master space, I mean, some of those people were NCAA people, right?
Sure.
And college swimmers, and it's like, I could sit here and just swim 4,000 yards and take it easy and get by for my day, but I'd rather feel like at the end of the day I'm tired and worn out and I've done something, so give me a push for that. Triathletes are particularly like that, right? In fact, I find the trouble with triathletes is that they are pushing so hard they don't ever get the comfort piece of that, and it's like
Agreed.
you've got to slow down to make that happen. But you were talking about, and on that topic of, about adult learners, okay? My experience with adults is that they want to understand, especially the scared adults. They want to understand. When you work with kids, they don't care, right? They don't want to understand. If anything, they want to just do, and maybe they don't even want to do, and you're having to try to get them to do, right?
Sure.
But adults who come in as adults want to be there, and they want to understand, and the understanding is a really important part for them to be able to take the next step into whatever learning piece it is. There's some information that when you give them, it's like, oh, really? Oh, and they've got these, you talked about schemas in their heads, right? They've got these schemas about what it's like in the water and how the water behaves. And especially for the scared adults, those are usually full of misconceptions. And so they have a truth. I nearly drowned, my uncle drowned, something like that. And so people can die in water. Well, that's a truth, right? But there are a bunch of misconceptions around it. And so one of the important things for adults is to be able to get some exposure to things that challenge those misconceptions so that they start to think, oh, is that true? Is that true? And they start to question the stuff that they've carried forward to see if it's legit or not. And as they find out where things aren't legit, then they begin to say, oh, okay, well, if that's not true, what is true? And then we get to move on into the next space. And you did that when you started with us, we had, I think there were 3 swimmers in your group, right? All of whom swam decently well, one of whom had been a triathlon guy for years who had suddenly become scared of the water, right?
Yes.
And so I think he just finally realized he wasn't invincible. He was getting older and thought, oh my gosh, if I'm not invincible, what happens if I'm in deep water? Because I really don't know what to do, right?
Sure.
I haven't needed it until now. I need it now. What do I do with that? And that whole experience with people who we usually think of as, oh, these are swimmers. There's no reason for them to be scared. Suddenly they're scared is a fascinating kind of a thing that if you've been swimming all your life and you just think everybody swims, or once you know it, you got it, and you find out, wow, you don't. It's really a challenge to think about, okay, how do I step back, or what's the piece that never got taught that I got to figure out how to teach for them to understand to help them move forward, right?
Sure.
For me, it's one of the cool challenges of being a coach, is figuring out what piece is missing and how do I add that piece to help them move on to get back to where they were or to get where they want to go.
Sure, and I think your point is great about the need for comprehension of an adult. Like they want to know. That's why adults that pick up new skills have such a difficulty, is because you're right, kids are just doing.
Right.
You give a kid 2 drumsticks and he's gonna bang on it until he realizes that something sounds good. He's like, oh, suddenly there's a rhythm here, and you figure it out. And creating those neural synapses of just what works, what doesn't. Your misconception, a great example, is thrashing in the water.
Yep.
A lot of people think if I move harder and faster, it's going to keep me afloat. big thing I talk about with my kids a lot is be water. I mean, I know it sounds, it sounds very Bruce Lee, but water moves gently. It moves in waveforms. Yes, in storms it crashes and such, but it's still rhythmic even then, right? And so aimless thrashing in deep water, when I was doing adult lessons, I went over it with actually a couple swimmers who were a little bit more comfortable so they could get themselves back up.
Yep.
But I said, I want you to actively try to thrash around and see what happens.
Yeah.
And even if you're a great floater, you won't be floating because you're creating all those pockets and things like that, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Another example is just going back of the example of the fragility of life. I think it takes one time to realize that even if I was a great swimmer, great drivers get in one, F1 for example, great drivers get in one major accident, and sometimes getting behind the wheel of a 200-mile-per-hour vehicle doesn't feel as good the next time you do it, right?
Yeah.
And skydivers and hang gliders and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
It takes one freak accident to really change how you feel about what you're doing, and so that's why we go about preventing that, or
exactly
mitigating some of those feelings that they might already have.
Or moving really, really slow and not pushing people who have come out of that place. Absolutely.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Thanks for watching today's video. If you liked it, be sure to subscribe, share, ring the bell, comment with any questions. If you're in the DFW area and you'd like more information on swim lessons or swim team, be sure to visit www.sigmaswim.org.